Who here has been to Vegas? Don't worry, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, so you don't have to tell me the details. But what is one of the most distinctive features about structures in Las Vegas? No windows. Why don't they have windows in the casinos in Vegas?
They want you to know clocks.
They don't have clocks either. They don't want you to know what time it is. They don't want you to be aware of things that are going on outside the structure, or their sanctuary, right? So on the one hand, one might think that, not having windows. So one might think that not having windows in a place where you pray could be of value. You sort of lock yourself into a hermetically sealed room, and all you have, no distractions, all you have the ability is to pray. But as we're going to see from the halacha, that's not considered to be the right thing. What seems to be the right thing that comes up for most of the poskim is that you're supposed to have windows in a Beis HaKnesses, and we need to examine why. So we'll study the texts, and we'll go through the tshuvas, and we'll see what the poskim say. The source text from Tanakh is based on a pasuk in Daniel, from chapter 6 in Daniel. Now this is an episode where Daniel is in the diaspora, he's in Bavel, and there's a king called Daryavesh who is being instigated by some of his courtiers that he should incite against the Jews. And they try to get Daniel in trouble, and they cause the king to come out with an edict that anyone who petitions any being, whether it be human being or deity, other than Darius himself, will be punishable. That's considered to be an offense against the crown. That was the edict that Darius gives out. And this was, of course, the precursor to Daniel being thrown into the Gov HaArayos. That's why he was thrown into the lion's den eventually, because he was perceived as violating this edict by praying to the Ribono Shel Olam. So the Daniel Kidei Yadad Di Rishim Kesava. So when Daniel finds out, and then the Metzudas in source number 2 gives you the Hebrew translation, when he finds out what is written in this edict, Al Lebaise, he goes up to his house. V'kavein pesichan la be'elisa, and he had windows that were cut out in his attic, neged Yerushalayim, that faced towards Jerusalem in the south. V'zimnin talasa v'yoma hu borech al birkohe, 3 times a day he prostrated himself on his knees, umitzaleh, and he prayed, umode kadam eloke, and he prayed before Hashem, Kol kavel di hava aved min katmastana, and thanked Hashem for all that He had done for him up until that point. Okay, so one of the features of this pasuk that you see is that Daniel goes and he davens by a window that's facing Yerushalayim. Okay. So the Gemara, there's 2 Gemaras that are identical, both in Maseches Brachos, one on Daf Lamed Aleph Amid Aleph, and the other one on Daf Lamed Beis, Daf Lamed Dalet Amid Beis. And it says, Omer Rabbi Chia bar Abba, La'olam yispalel adam babayit sheyesh bo chalonos. A person should always daven in a house that has windows. Shenemar v'kavein psichan lei, as it says in the pasuk by Daniel, that he had a place to daven which had a window facing Yerushalayim. And now, what's the reason? What's the reason for having this window? So Rashi explains, chalonos, shegormin lo sheyechavein libo. This causes a person to have more kavanah. It focuses his attention. In what way? Shehu mistakel klape shamayim v'libo nichna. That you can look out and see the sky. You can see the sky from your window. And when you can see the sky from your window, your heart is humbled. So that's the benefit, according to Rashi, of having a window that you can look out of while you're davening. So far, so good. Rabbeinu Yonah, who's the commentary on the Rif on Maseches Brachos instead of the Ran, he tells us there's a slightly different reason. He says in source number 5 as follows: Babaya sheyesh bo chalonos, in a house that has windows, efshar lomar shahatamhu, that we could suggest that the reason is mipnei sha'al yedei re'iyas ha'or tisyashev da'ato yoser, that through seeing light, you'll have more yishuv hadas, you'll have more of a settled mind. V'yuchal lechaven kera'ui, and you'll be able to have proper kavana when there's light in the room. Now, one could argue that according to this argument, one obviates the need for a window by having artificial light. You could make that argument, or you could alternatively argue that no, lighting that comes from the natural sky has a different quality, has a different ability. Fluorescent lights don't give me that much yishuv hadas, but natural daylight that flows into a room gives a person a sense of yishuv hadas, is relaxing. And I'm sure they've done studies about this to demonstrate that daylight has a calming effect, and sunlight is when it's sunny outside and so forth.
This argument of Rabbeinu Yonah would justify having stained glass windows.
Okay, 1 second, Alan. We're going to get to all the nafkaminas. You're jumping the gun. Give us a chance to go through the Makoros, and then we'll open up the floor. Inami, alternatively, Rod Salomar Shiu Psuchos Chalonos Keneged HaMizrach. It's also possible that there's a specific imperative to have windows that are facing east. Now, Rabbeinu Yonah is writing this in Europe. Daniel was facing south because he was in Bavel. But the point is, you want to be facing east or whatever direction Yerushalayim, Kidisa Bikra Neged Yerushalayim, Mipnei Sha'al Yedei HaHabata Hazos, that looking through the window and thinking about what's beyond me towards the east, Yechavein B'tfila So Keneged HaMakom Yoser. You'll be able to focus your attention on what lies ahead of you, which is Yerushalayim, which is the Beis HaMikdash. V'tia tfilasa ritzuya umikubelas, and that way your prayer will be more desired by Hashem and more acceptable to Hashem because you're more focused, you're more in the zone, thinking about the place of the Shekhinah, thinking about the temple.
That inami fits better with the pasuk in Daniel too.
It certainly does. It certainly fits better with the pasuk because there it says that Daniel specifically focused on Yerushalayim as the place where he wanted to put the window. Right. Okay. So the Pri Megadim does exactly what Alan was beginning to do, which is to say, so what's the nafkamina between Rashi and Rabbeinu Yonah? So let's take a look. He says, "V'nafkamina l'Rabbeinu Yonah ein sarach neged hamizrach." According to Rabbeinu Yonah, in his first answer, we should say, where there's a desire for daylight to stream into the room, you don't need the window to be dafka in the east, where people are facing when they're davening. Ularashi neged hamizrach. According to Rashi, Rashi says, what's the purpose of the window? To look out of the window and to see heaven. So if that's the function, then having a window behind me, it may provide me with the benefit of having daylight stream in, but it doesn't provide me with the visibility of heaven like Rashi had talked about. Or v'inami b'keren dromis mizrachis tzfonis d'mitzadi ktsas v'roa shaper dami. Alternatively, even according to Rashi, if you would have the windows that are sort of like on the southeast or northeast corners of the room, so that even from the corner of your eye you could catch a glimpse of the sky, that would also be acceptable according to Rashi. Now remember, according to Rabbeinu Yonah, you can have the windows even in back of you and you still fulfill the benefit of windows. But according to Rashi, there has to be visibility for the parishioner to be able to see through the windows and to see the sky. Okay? So, as far as stained glass, Alan, so you could make the same, I think you could make a similar argument. If the glass is opaque so you can't see out of the window, certainly for Rabbeinu Yonah that fulfills the objective, but according to Rashi, I think there's room to equivocate. Because the very fact that I know that I'm looking at this window and I can imagine the sky beyond the window, maybe.
Skylight would be great.
Skylight would be great according to Rashi. Okay, so maybe. But I think you're making a valid point with stained glass as well.
But when the Pri Megadim says the Rashi negative Mizrach, that's lav dafka, right? That depends on where you are.
Right, that's why I pointed that out. For Daniel, he was facing, Yerushalayim was south of where he was. So he's speaking in the vernacular where Jews are in Europe, right, when he's writing this.
When he's studying, shouldn't he be either looking in the book or closing his eyes?
Yes, that's another good point. We're going to see the Beis Yosef is going to ask that question. Hold on, folks. We still have a few places to go. Let's take a look now. The Maharsha, in his Chidushei Agados, tries to suggest perhaps even a third reason. Actually, we've seen three reasons so far. We've seen one reason in Rashi to look at the sky. We've seen two reasons in Rabbeinu Yonah. One is to have daylight come in to inspire you, to give you a good, psychologically, emotionally, it enhances your experience. Yishuv Hadas is the term Rabbeinu Yonah uses. And the second reason, he says, you want to look at what's beyond you, towards Yerushalayim. That also is a benefit, not just looking at the heavens, but looking towards Yerushalayim. Okay. The Maharsha says, he says, Hatam Ein B'Pirish Rashi Uvatosvus Rabbeinu Yonah. But then he says, Va'od yesh lomar. He says, but I would also suggest the following. Another answer. Debe'ein chalonos havale makom sasum. When you don't have windows in a room, it's sealed. The room is sealed. It's a sealed room. Ki'ilu ein misham makom litfilaso la'alos. So psychologically, you feel like the words that you're uttering don't have room to escape. There's no room. There's no escape portal for them to go up to heaven. The mihai time akamer le'el revel lagazer tanesa biyom di'iva mishum d'ksiv sakosa b'anon lech ma'avor. That's the same reason why Rava would not decree a fast on a cloudy day, because a cloudy day sort of demonstrated, at least psychologically, whether in reality or not is irrelevant, but psychologically people would thought that this cloud cover was creating a partition between themselves and heaven. And so that's why Rava felt that there was no benefit in decreeing a fast on that day. He would wait until the skies parted so that there could be sort of a more direct connection between people and Shemayim. And so for the same reason, maybe you could argue that that's why you need windows, says the Maharsha, so that people feel like there's more of a direct connection between their words to go up to Shemayim. V'amar al zeh, and he says it works out great, because the next piece of the Gemara on Daf Lamed Daled Amud Beis, in Brachos, talks about the halacha that a person should not daven in a bik'ah, should not daven in an open plain. And that's also codified in halacha, that a person should not stand outside without any walls at all. Let's say in a wide open field. You're in the middle of Kansas, and there's cornfields all around. So the Gemara says you shouldn't daven in a wide open field. That's considered to be chutzpah. It's considered to be a sort of like a brazen act, that you're just out in the open, in the middle of nowhere, and you're just shouting out, right? I've always had a little bit of a difficulty with that, because I would think that communing with nature would be a beautiful thing.
Yitzchak.
Yeah, lasuach basadeh. But you'd have to say that what Yitzchak did was that he created some kind of surrounding environment or habitat for himself, so that he felt, because what the Gemara advocates is you should have some level of intimacy or enclosure around you for humility purposes. When you're out in the open, in the middle of nowhere, like this, so then it's almost like a little bit more brazen. So anyway, so that's why he says that's the continuity of the next piece of the Gemara, because the Gemara says Vim Tomar biyoser parutz kegon bebika hu ma'ola biyoser la'alos misham tfilas mikol tzad be'ein mafsiko. So therefore, because if the whole reason you're supposed to have windows is to give an escape portal for your praise to go up to Shemayim, so then you should argue that when there's no partitions at all, I mean the outside wide open, then for sure that should be a good way to pray, right? So that the prayer goes straight up without any impediments. And that's why the Gemara has to say that no, the very next piece of Gemara is that it's a person is considered to be a mechutzaf, like a little bit brazen, if he davens in a place that's wide open without feeling that sense of some level of enclosure and humility or modesty when he's davening. Okay, so we've now seen 4 reasons for why there's an imperative to have windows in a Beisak, when a person is davening. Now, here we get now to that issue of what about if, according to Rashi, you're supposed to be looking out of the window to see heaven, or according to Rabbi, you're supposed to look out of the window to look towards Yerushalayim. What about the distraction factor of not looking at anything other than your siddur or closing your eyes when you're davening? Right? What about that? Because you're not supposed to get distracted. So let's take a look. The Torah tells us in Siman Tzadi Hey that there's another halacha, and that is v'tzarich sheyachuf rosho ma'at sheyiyu einav lamata la'aretz, that a person when he's davening should bend his head over slightly so that his eyes are facing downwards towards the earth when he's davening. Shenemar v'hayu einai v'libi sham kol hayimim, says my eyes and my heart will be there all the days, referring to my eyes and my heart focused on the temple in the temple structure, not going anywhere, not wandering anywhere else. So that's the halacha that is completely separate from the halacha that's codified in Siman Sadi about the law of having windows. So the law of having windows is in Siman Sadi in the Shulchan Aruch, and the law of keeping your head down and head bent over is in Siman Sadi Hey. Comes along the Beis Yosef in Siman Sadi Hey and says, I see a direct contradiction here. There's a stira here in halacha. He says, Ve'im Tomar, it's source number 9. Beis Yosef says, Heichi amrinon shetzarach sheyitain einov lamata. How can the Shulchan Aruch advocate, how can the Torah advocate that I have to keep my head down with my eyes facing towards the floor? Ve'amrinon beperak ein omdim al yispal adam ela b'bayis sheyesh bo chalonos. A person is supposed to daven in a house that has windows. And Kasav Rabbeinu Hagadol Mahari Avohav Zal Mipnei Kush Yazu, he says it was from the power, the force of this question, that's why Pirshu Talmidei HaRabbeinu Yonah the time of Debayis Sheish Bo Chalanos Eno Ela Kedei Sheyabayis Mesukan Ba'avir Tov. He says it was from the force of that question, of that contradiction. That's why Rabbeinu Yonah says that the benefit of a window is not that you should look through it, but the benefit of the window is to provide natural daylight streaming into the room. And the word avir, by the way, is problematic because avir implies air current. What if you have a sealed window? So many are gores, the word that should be changed to not avir, but rather be'or tov. That you should have good light coming into the room. So he says, but that's the reason, the motivation that Rabbeinu Yonah said. Why couldn't Rabbeinu Yonah learn like Rashi? He couldn't learn like Rashi because according to Rashi, you're contradicting the imperative of keeping your head down and your eyes down. According to Rashi, you're supposed to be looking up, look through the window. Oh, the majesty of the heavens, God, I'm looking towards you. But that's not the halach. You're supposed to be looking downwards. So how can there'll be a halach of having windows? So therefore, Rabbeinu Yonah says the purpose of windows is not to look through the windows. The purpose of the windows is to have light coming in, to give you yishuv hadas. But he says, Avol Rashi, Shapir Shachalonis Gorban Lo Shiachavin Libo. But according to Rashi, who says that the whole function of the windows when you're davening is so that you can focus your attention on the heavens outside, Shu Mistakel Klape Shamayim, that you gaze towards the heavens, the Libo Nichna, and that humbles your heart, Kasha. It's a problem. So answers the Beis Yosef.
Can I suggest an answer before we get to Beis Yosef?
Go ahead.
First of all, you come in and you see, so you intuitively know it's there. And the other way is that, you have more senses than just the eyes. It's like, maybe it's the same thing. You're sensing it's there, so it's like you're looking out.
Right, so you want to say, that it's there, you're not gazing at it while you're actually davening. You look at it when you come in, you look at it when you go out.
God forbid you're sick, your mother, your mother's there. You have to look at your mother to know that she's there.
Right. So he says, V'yesh lomar shemasha kosav sheyistakel klape shemaim. What does the Beis Yosef say? That when we say that you should gaze out the window towards the heaven, eno rot salomar sheyihiyu einav tiluyos lamala kol zman hatfila. That doesn't mean, Rashi's not suggesting that your eyes should be focused on the window and the skies outside the window the whole time you're davening. Ela sha'al derech ha'avara im yistakel klape shamayim yichna levavo adkan. But, just in passing, you'll look out the window while you're, in between psukim, or while you're during chazaras hashatz, or whatever it is, in passing, you'll look through the window, and that'll humble your heart. But it's not while you're actively praying. That's not what you're supposed to be doing. You're not supposed to look out the window. It's in between. Because we're all human beings, and we're not actively praying constantly. So that's the answer. The Magen Avraham sort of modifies the language. It's interesting. By the time it gets to the Magen Avraham in Siman Sadi, he says, Isa b'gemara lo yispalel adam elo b'bayis sheyesh bo chalonos. Even though a person has to be facing his eyes downwards, so the Magen Avraham says this is only for the schleppers like us who lose our kavana once in a while. That's why we need windows, so that when you're looking up from your siddur, when you're looking up from your active davening, you'll have something to look at and gaze out the windows and say, the Ribbon Shalom, His world. I'm connecting with the Almighty. There's something here, right? But it's for people who can't have kavanah the whole time. So that's what the windows are for. Okay. So all of this is great, right? So up until now, the shul is not supposed to be like Las Vegas without windows, right? It's supposed to be a place where light either streams in, or we have in between our times when we're having kavanah, we have the ability to look outside, or like the Maharsha says, that we have the ability to have this sense that our prayers are escaping and going up to heaven, or like the Rabbeinu Yonah in his second answer, that if the windows should be facing east, so that we should focus on what's going on in front of us in Yerushalayim. Yeah.
Why can't you say it's a Mikdash Ma'at, like the Beit Mikdash, and have windows like the Beit Mikdash?
That's
near to me, it'll be a simple answer.
That's a great segue, Saul, to the Rambam's tshuva that we're about to see, because according to that argument that it's based on the idea of Mikdash Ma'at, Daniel, when he davened in his attic, was not davening in a synagogue. He was not davening in a Mikdash Ma'at. So there really was no reason for Daniel to have a window because he was davening in the privacy of his home. So the question, therefore, really what your suggestion is begging is
what a Navi does.
Right. No. But the nafkamina, according to what you're saying, is that if it's based on the structural analogy of a synagogue to the temple, what if I'm davening at home? Is there a need for me to daven by a window? Right. If I'm davening b'yichidus in my home, should I daven by a window? Is a synagogue construct imperative, or is it a prayer construct imperative? So up until now, we've seen that it's a prayer construct imperative, and the Rambam's going to go even further and say that it only applies to private places of prayer and not to the synagogue. So hold on just a second. We're going to see that in just a moment. Yeah.
Well, it strikes me as a problem because we haven't talked about looking outside. We've talked about looking heavenward, which means the windows have to be way above eye level. It's not to look out and see a street scene.
Right. It would imply that the windows have to be so high that you can see the sky.
And not see the street.
Or see both. Or, according to Rabbeinu Yonah, look towards, to be able to face eastward. According to Rabbeinu Yonah, the imperative is not to see the sky, but to look eastward, that you know that Yerushalayim is beyond you.
But if you're looking eastward into the Shuk,
right,
when you're davening, it seems
that's quite distracting, isn't it?
That's right.
Okay, we're going to get to that as well. Okay, great.
So, if I may, so are we trying to differentiate and say this is a din on the shul versus a din on the individual? Because I'm looking at how is we don't see anywhere where the Shulchan Aruch comes out to halacha. In other words, is this one of these, it's better to, or is this actually halacha that you must? So looking at this room
it's
here,
a halacha that you must if you have the option. It's a question of is it ma'akev or not. It's a question of it's ma'akev.
Can you daven in this room here?
Yeah, that's a question.
Right.
Is it well, you can. No one's arguing that if you don't have windows, you can't daven. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't use that language.
Oh, but maybe why not? In other words,
but when you choose to daven, you have to choose a place which has windows. And if that place is not available, then you can still daven. No one's suggesting that you can't daven. We have that language so far in the Shulchan Aruch we haven't seen. But the Shulchan Aruch is saying, yes, lechatchila, you have to have windows wherever you daven. Take a look at the tshuva of the Rambam. Good segue once again. Good segue. Now let's take a look. Shilos Tshuvas HaRambam, which is one of sort of the lesser studied texts of the Rambam. In Tshuva Siman Reish Tes Zayin, the Rambam says as follows: She'ela Uma Yomar Adonenu Badavar Masha Omer Rabosenu Zal. What will our master? The person who's asking the question is writing to the Rambam and says, please tell us, our master, what's your opinion about the Gemara Omer Rabbi Chanina la'olam al yispal adam elo b'bayis sheyesh bo chalonos shenemar b'kaven psichon le'ba'alisa neged Yerushalayim o zu halacha shelafi hamorim. He says, if this is taka the halacha that we paskin like, ketzad motzim anu mekomos harbe shemispalalim bahem ve'ein bahem chalonos. How is it that we have places like the Gruda Beis Medrash where we daven and there are no windows? How is such a thing possible? Uma inyan hachalonos le'inyan tefillah. And what is the connection between windows and prayer? Yoreinu Adonenu uscharo kavul min hashamayim. May our master or our Lord teach us this law and may his reward be doubled from heaven. That's the way, of course, reverentially the Rambam was referred to by his Sephardic questioner. So HaTeshuvah. So the Rambam writes the response is as follows: Bate Knesios v'hamekomos hameyuchadim l'tfilas tzibor ein maslim bahem chalonos ve'ein mashkichim bahem. A public place of prayer for where the tzibor gathers to daven does not need to have windows. It's not something that we concern ourselves with. Ve'ein divrei Rabbi Chanina ela biyachid hamispalel beveso. And Rabbi Chanina's requirement of having windows is only when you're davening privately in your home. Kemo shehaya oseh Daniel alav hashalom. Lefi sheratzui lo kedei la'orer hakavana. Because it was something that he wanted to do in order to arouse his kavana. Gam lechavein panav lachalon pasuach la'avir. He wanted to also have a window facing the air, facing the sky, or facing the air that's in front of him, kidei sheyitzayer b'dimyono shehu keneged Yerushalayim, as if to imagine to himself, I'm in front of Jerusalem, I'm in front of the temple. Ve'ein chotzitzin beino uveina lo kir v'lo koros. And there was nothing between him. There was no wall. There were no beams. Lefi shehu diber b'chalonos, because he spoke right in front of the window. Sheya'avor mabat haro'eh mehem ba'avir u'v'merchav. That he wanted the vision of the seer to be directly into the air and into the expanse in front of him, so that he can imagine that he's in front of Jerusalem. Ve'ein safek shedimuyo shel zeh v'ti'uro mechayvin kavana gedola. And there's no question that such an imagined scenery, when you place that in your mind of the thinking about this window in front of you and the seeing the expanse in front of you, that creates tremendous kavana. Kein nirali v'kasav Moshe. That's what it would seem to me, and that's what Moses has written. That's what Moshe Maimonides has written. Now, it seems from the Rambam that there's dafka an imperative to only have windows when you're davening b'yechidus, because when you're davening with a tzibor, you already have built-in kavana. When you're davening b'yechidus, you need extra kavana, so you need something to focus your attention on to prevent you from getting distracted from just not being with the tzibor. Yes, sir.
It's better to daven in shul by yourself too.
We do paskin that way.
Right.
Yeah, we
Not
do.
shul by yourself.
Yeah, so that would seem to go against this Rambam. It's a very good question. It seems to go against this Rambam because, right? So maybe the Beis HaKnesses itself, even when there's no tzibur, maybe the Beis HaKnesses itself is ma'orer es hakavan. You're in front of the Aron Kodesh. You have all of the artifacts of the synagogue there. Okay, fine. So the Rashash actually cites this tshuva. By the way, the Kesef Mishnah makes mention of it as well, because the Rambam in Mishnah Torah does not make this distinction that he writes in the tshuva. When and that in itself gives us there's something fishy here. There's something fishy here. Because if the Rambam codifies this in Mishnah Torah and says straight out, you always, wherever you pray, you should have windows, and does not distinguish between whether you daven b'yechidus or whether you daven in a synagogue, then why does he make such a distinction in the Tshuvas Rambam, which he's writing to a specific person asking the question? There are those who have pointed out that the Rambam, the distinction can be cited because when the Rambam talks about binyan beis hakneses, the construction of a synagogue, he does not state explicitly that you should build the shul with windows. So they want to argue that it's the only way to reconcile this steer is with this tshuva that you don't, because he didn't write that you have to build the shul with windows, this indicates that he only means for this halacha to apply when you're davening outside the shul. But it's still a little fishy to me. There's something wrong here. There's something now. Sometimes a person writes a tshuva for a specific questioner because, of course, when someone writes you and say, the shul that I daven in my community has no windows, so what should I do? Well, what are your options? You're not going to go to shul. You're not going to go to shul because it doesn't have windows. So many times, a person who's paskening in a tshuva has to take into consideration what the alternatives are and what the ramifications of the psak are going to be to that individual. So just keep that in mind. But the Rashash picks up on this, and the Rashash is puzzled why this tshuva from the Rambam is not cited by the poskim. He says, La'olam yispal, in source number 12, he says, La'olam yispal adam b'bayis shesh bo chalonos, Shenemar, etc., etc., etc. The Sofa Neged Yerushalayim, Mashma Tzon Shiach Chalonos Neged Yerushalayim. So first the Rashash points out on his commentary on the Gemara that it's mashma that the windows have to be facing Jerusalem. So we've already seen the Pri Megadim make that same diuk according to Rashi. The Chen Kosev Lahedja HaRambam VeHaShulchan Aruch, and both the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch say that they should be facing Yerushalayim. U'tmihani al Beis HaKnesses Shel Chevra de Gam Chesha Depo Irenu. He says, I got a big problem. I don't know the name of the town. I should have probably done more research. Where was the Rashash's Beis HaKnesses? It was in a place called Gam Chesha. In our town, he says, our shul doesn't have windows. She'ein sham chalonos, lo l'ruach mizrach, va'af lo l'ruach darom. Not towards the east, not towards the south. V'gam Beis HaKnesses hagdola, heima l'mayla begova hakosel. And even in the great synagogue, I don't know what great synagogue the Rashash is talking about, but even in the great synagogue, he says where there are windows, it's much higher than eye view. So people don't have the utility of being able to look out of the windows to be able to see eastwards towards Yerushalayim. V'Rashi pirish lekaman b'sof perek hatam k'dei sheyeh mistakal klape shamayim. He says for Rashi it's not so much of a problem because for Rashi, even if the windows are higher than you can still look out of them and see heaven. So that's not a problem for Rashi. But if you're going to look like the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, that it's in order to be able to see towards Yerushalayim, then how can you see towards Yerushalayim when the windows are so high? So he says, Shuvra isi bekesef Mishnah, Sham shehevi mishmeita harambam b'tshuva dedinze eno ela b'yachin hamispalel b'veso. I then noticed that this halacha, according to the Rambam, as cited in the tshuva, only applies when you're davening in the privacy of your home. V'ulai midika amar yispalel adam mashma adam yichidi davka. And it could be that's the language of the Gemara. When the Gemara says la'olam yispalel adam, it says a man should daven, when he davens, should daven with a window, that could be, that's the diuk. It's adam in the singular because we're not talking about a tzibur, we're talking about an individual. V'chein midika amar babayis v'la'amar b'beis hakneses dikte kain. And similarly, that the language of the Gemara is babayis sheyesh bo chalonos, in a house that has windows, right? It doesn't say bebeis hakneses sheyesh bo chalonos, and therefore maybe that's what caused the Rambam to make this distinction. He says u'tmihani al ha'achronim shelo hiviuhu, but as a pella, he says I don't understand why the poskim, why the achronim, the poskim, have not cited this Rambam. When you look in Shulchan Aruch and you look in the Torah, you look in the Beis Yoseph, no one makes mention of this distinction between a house and a Beis HaKnesses. Everyone, the consensus of the poskim is not to completely ignore this tshuva of the Rambam, and to say that it makes no difference whether you're davening at home or you're davening at shul, you have to have windows. And that the Rashash says, I don't get it. I don't know why everyone's ignoring this tshuva from the Rambam.
Yerushalayim Shel Ma'ala also, right? I mean, it's a little bit of a joke what I'm saying, but it's also, you can see Yerushalayim Shel Ma'ala.
Well, yes, we're going to make allusion to the Zohar is going to make that point shortly, we'll see. Anyway, the Pri Megadim cites this tshuva from the Rambam, and he explains, he says, V'hainu tetfilas harabim ein sarach lizuchuyos kol kacho mekubeles. He says the reason why when you're davening publicly, when you're davening with a tzibur, you don't need windows, is because the tefillah of the rabbim does not need as much merit. It doesn't need to be a supercharged prayer. The very fact that you're davening with a tzibur to begin with gives it the merit that it needs in order for it to be received by God. But when you're davening privately, that's the svar. When you're davening privately, you need to have the supercharge of the window to get you going. Okay?
Either that or the escape route.
Or the escape route according to the Maharsha. Right. But the Shulchan Aruch does not make this distinction. The Chen Kosev Levush. The Levush writes explicitly. Levush is a contemporary sort of the Shulchan Aruch, and so he has the same level of authority as the Shulchan Aruch. But he writes V'tzarach liftach bebeis hakneses chalonos, that you have to have windows in the beis hakneses v'chein amad davar, and that's what we do today, says the Pri Megadim. We have windows in our Batei Knesses. So obviously, if you're davening in a shul that doesn't have windows, you shouldn't don't be upset, because there's a tshuva from the Rambam, right? But you see clearly that there's a machlokas going on. So If the Prima Gadim says v'chein amadavar, that we always have windows in our Batei Knesset, then there's certainly an imperative to install windows whenever possible, right? So let's take a look at the Aruch HaShulchan. He has three seifim on this, but I left out the first seif in the Aruch HaShulchan because it's really basically a recap of what we've seen already from the Rishonim. But in Siman Sadi, we'll do Sif Vav and Sif Zayin in the Aruch HaShulchan, and then we'll finish off with the tshuva from the Achiezer, from Reb Chaim Oizer. Okay, so the Aruch HaShulchan says in Sif Vav, Ularashi tzarach lomar dahadichsiv neged Yerushalayim. So the Aruch HaShulchan is bothered with, according to Rashi, who says that the purpose of the window is to look heavenward. So then why is it necessary to have the window facing Jerusalem? Why does Daniel have his window facing Jerusalem? He says, Ein hakavana rak sheyiskar Yerushalayim, ela sheyistakel klape shamayim. He says, the meaning is just that you should remember Jerusalem when you're davening, but you should be looking towards heaven. In other words, look up, think about Jerusalem, but you're looking at heaven. So therefore, for Rashi, it's not that important that you should be able to see forward. Even if the windows are well above eye level, that's fine. You fulfill the issue of being able to see the sky. Avol milashon harambam lo nira kain. But the language of the Rambam in Mishnah Torah, which I don't have copied for you here, by the way, because the Aruch HaShulchan quotes it. He says, "Shekasa b'perek hey din vav v'tzarach liftoach chalonos opsachim keneged Yerushalayim kedei lihispalel kenegdan." The Rambam says you need to have windows that are open towards Jerusalem in order that you can daven opposite them to be able to look out towards Jerusalem. Umavur dahakavanahu rak mipnei Yerushalayim, and it's clear from the Rambam that the objective is you have to be able to see Jerusalem. Now, if you remember from the Prima Gadim previously, he had said that according to Rashi, you have to at least have visibility to the windows. According to Rabbeinu Yonah, you don't have to see the windows at all. According to Rashi, you have to be able to see the windows, even if you can't see anything but sky outside of the windows. According to the Rambam, not only do you have to see the windows, but when you look outside those windows, you have to see in front of you, facing eastward towards Jerusalem. Otherwise, the windows do not serve any purpose. He says, because that's going to humble the heart. V'chein mashmi b'divrei talmidei Rabbeinu Yonah shekasvu v'zel lashonam ef shalomar she'atam mipnei shadei ri'iyas ha'or tisyashev da'ito yoser v'yuchal lechaven keroi inami rot salomar she'yuchalonos poschem keneged hamizrach kideisa b'kra neged Yerushalayim mipnei shal ha'avtach azos ichaven b'tfilaso keneged hamakom Yoseph v'tiyat tfilaso v'tzum kubelas akan l'shano. So the second answer in Rabbeinu Yonah stems with the Rambam, is in consonance with the Rambam. So you have basically three halachic nafkaminas. According to the first teretz of Rabbeinu Yonah, you don't need to see the windows at all as long as light streams in. According to Rashi, you need to see the windows either directly in front of you or to the sides of you so that you can at least catch occasionally glimpses of the sky. And according to the Rambam in the second answer in Rabbeinu Yonah, you have to be looking right at the window ahead of you to see forward, not just the sky, but forward ahead of you so that you can think about what is ahead, which is Yerushalayim. So then he goes on in Sif Zayin, and he says as follows. He says, Mihu al kolpanim nira dilachol hapirushim tzarach lihispalul keneged hachalonos davka. He says it would seem that according to all of these explanations, you would have to daven opposite a window. Now, of course, he's only citing from the second answer of Rabbeinu Yonah. But the first answer of Rabbeinu Yonah, you wouldn't need to. V'lo ra'inu mishi yadaktek bazeh. And we've never seen anyone to have such a kapeda that I'm davening mamish in front of a window. Right? Even those people who are makbid to have windows in their synagogue don't construct the windows so that the entire Mizrach Vant on both sides of the Aron Kodesh is all glass. Because that's essentially what you'd have to do in order to be able to face Jerusalem and have everyone have visibility to the outside. He says, Va'adarabba, al pirov bochrim lihispalel b'kosel shelo keneged hachalon. He says, and just the opposite. In most situations, people want to daven in front of an opaque surface like a wall that's not looking out to a window for the obvious reason of distraction, yes? Umakom harav b'chol makom eitzel aron hakodesh She'ein sham chalon. Where does the Rav of the Shul face? He's facing the Aron, where there's no window. De keneged hachalon yesh bilbul hadas. Mehaholchim lifnei hachalon. He says, if you had a window right in front of you where you're davening, you'd have bilbul hadas. You'd be confused. I'll never forget. I remember one of my earliest memories of like going to I don't even know if it was some youth event where they would tell you Chasidish Shemaisim. So they told the story about this great holy Jew who was the shamus of the Rebbe, and he would daven, put on talis and tefillin, and then he would stand and look out the window the whole time. And so one of the people sees him looking out the window the whole time that he's davening, and they're saying, what kind of person are you? How can you possibly have kavanah? You're looking at everything going on outside. You're not thinking about the words of the davening. And then when he gave them back the talis and tefillin, it was drenched in perspiration because of his intense kavanah. And all I was thinking was, I'm never lending anyone my talis and tefillin. But no, the point of the story was that you're not supposed to look out a window when you're davening. You're supposed to be focusing on the prayer.
I think it's in California. I recently saw a shul, maybe the Rav knows. The entire eastern wall is glass.
Uh-huh.
Everything else is no.
There is something called the Glass Cathedral in Orange County, but that's a different religion, yeah. In Bethlehem, in Pennsylvania, there's a conservative shul where the structure is very much glass. Maybe it's Adat Yeshurun in La Jolla. There are a lot of glass in that synagogue too. I remember saying, I don't know if it's on the Mizrach or not.
It's California.
Yeah.
It's right in Mizrach.
Okay.
Keter Torah and Teaneck is all glass panels.
Yeah. Okay. So he says, "V'nir lanias daiti to ha'olam sovrin." So he says, well, so how do we reconcile this? Okay, that at least according to the Rambam, you're supposed to be looking out a window when you're davening. He says, "The ha'olam sovrim midelo amar hashas keneged hachalon ela babayis sheyesham chalonos." He says, look at the language of the Gemara. It doesn't say that you have to be facing a window. It says you should be in a structure which has windows. Mashma dahakpedahu rak sheyiyu chalonos behabayis. That there should be windows in the house. Avolo sheyispalel davka keneged hachalon, but not that you should daven mamish opposite the window. The divrei Rabbeinu Shamar Kadesh Yistakel Yocholios Gamim Eino Omid Keneged Hachalon Mamash, and therefore even the Rambam who says that you want to be able to look outside and see towards Jerusalem, it's not that you're standing mamish in front of the window, but you have the ability to walk over occasionally and peek out. That's also okay. V'chein Mevur Miloshon HaZohar Pekude, and here he quotes the Zohar, which is also the source for why the Shulchan Aruch writes that you should have how many windows in a synagogue? 12. So this is, what's it based on? It's not based on it's based on Sod. People think that it's based on the 12 Shvatim. It could be related to that, but it's not. That's not the source. The source is the Zohar. What does it say in the Zohar? Parshas Pekudei, Va'alda kol beis hakneses deles bei chalonos lav atar litzalo'a bei. The Zohar says that any synagogue that does not have windows is not a proper place to pray. Daha beis hakneses delasata. The kabel beis hakneses dile'ela, as Rabbi Yisrael had said, that every synagogue that is earthly corresponds to the upper synagogue up in heaven. The isbe tracer chalonos ilain, which has 12 holy or lofty windows. The hachanami lisata, and that's why you need to have 12 windows in every earthly beis hakneses as well. This is cited by the poskim. It's brought down in Shulchan Aruch that you should have 12 windows based on this Zohar. It's one of those few occasions when the Zohar plays prominently in Psak Halacha. And therefore, Harei Shalo Hikpid Rak Shiu Bo Chalonos. So but the Aruch HaShulchan says what we're pulling out of this Zohar is that you see that the Zohar doesn't say you got to have the 12 windows in front of you that you can peek out of them, but it says that you have to have a Beis HaKnesses which has 12 windows. The Shiyu Yud Beis Chalonos, right? V'chein hamirag ledaktik b'Yud Beis Chalonos k'she'efshar. He therefore says that that's the proper minhag, that you should have 12 windows whenever possible. U'mitzvah lishmoa divrei hazohar, and it's a mitzvah to follow the words of the Zohar. V'chein kosav Rabbeinu Beis Yoseph b'sif daled shetov shi Yud Beis Chalonos ayin sham. So that's the tov laser. In other words, that's the lashon of tov shiyiyu, right? It's the Shulchan Aruch which says you have to have windows is more than just tov. It's a halacha. Halacha is whenever possible daven in a place where there are windows. tov, if you're going to build a Beis HaKnesses, it's good to have 12 windows in the place where you're going to build your Beis HaKnesses, because there's an understanding that it's not always convenient to have 12 windows, and it's not always convenient from an architectural standpoint to construct 12 windows in a space. But whenever feasible, whenever structurally feasible, you should have 12 windows in the place where you daven. We'll finish off with a tshuva from Reb Chaim Ozer, and then we'll be done. So the Reb Chaim Ozer was asked the following shaila: Al sheilasu im rishoyim l'shanos es hamizrach litzad safon. So Rabbi Yisrael, you'll love this question because he quotes be'asher l'divrei ha'architector. Because the question is, are you allowed to change the direction of the davening in the shul from east to north? Because according to the architect, ha'adrikal, which is the proper word in Hebrew, adrikal, proper word in Hebrew, im yasu es hamizrach ha'amiti, that if they create the Beis HaKnesses facing east, yuchal heyos ki bizman min hazmanim yivne echad hashchenim koisel kenegdo v'ya'afiloso. The concern is that since we're going to be building the windows on the place facing the wall where we're davening, our concern is that over time the synagogue land is situated in a place where there's going to be building to the east of the shul, and therefore there's an anticipation that at some point in the future one of the neighbors may put up a big structure and block the daylight coming into the windows. But if we build in the north, maybe it's facing a street, to a large boulevard or something, there's no such concern. So the architect has suggested to us, says Reb Chaim Ozer, that we should build our Mizrach Vant in the north, facing north, instead of having the Mizrach Vant facing the east. So that was the shaila, because of the concern of the windows, and the question is, what should we do? That's what they asked Reb Chaim Ozer. Okay? So hineni lahashiva. So here's my answer. Ki ein l'shanos neged halacha pesuka b'gemar b'shulchan aruch. You should never change what is already gepaskened in the Gemara and Shulchan Aruch, that you have to have the prayer in the synagogue facing east. V'im omnam chalonos mitzad hamizrach gam kein dina de Gemara, and I do acknowledge that it's also halachically important to have the windows in the east part of the synagogue. The Gemara brachos lamed aleph lamed dalet of Atur Shulchan Aruch Archaim Simin Sadi v'yun sham b'hagos harashash the brachos. He says, first of all, he's citing the Rambam's opinion. Remember, we said according to Rashi and according to the Rabbeinu Yonah, it's not imperative that it be in the east facing Yerushalayim, but according to the Rambam and the way the Shulchan Aruch cites the halacha, it is. But he says, but take a look at the Rashash, which we saw together. Mashi hispale al beis medrash bevilna, bevilna she'en sham chalonos b'mizrach. He says in Vilna they don't have windows in the east. Vehevi kishitas harambam bepe'er hador muva bekesef mishnah beperek beis mehilchas tefila shirak biyachid armu v'lo bebeis haknesses. That the only way that the Rashash is able to get out of the fact that some shuls in his town in Vilna don't have don't have windows, is that this halacha says the Rambam only applies to a private home, not to a synagogue. V'hispalei al haposkim shelo hiviu das Rambam, and the Rashash was at a loss to understand why the poskim don't bring this Rambam. And he says ve'efshir debediktuk nakar Shulchan Aruch siman sadi sifdalet tzarich liftoch psachim o chalanos neged Yerushalayim kedei lihispalel kenegdan v'tov shiyeh bebeis haknesses yud beit chalonos ad kan l'shana. So he says, let's take a look carefully at the language of the Shulchan Aruch. He says you have to open up windows or apertures corresponding to Yerushalayim so that you can pray in front of them, and it's good that a beis haknesses should have 12 windows. So uvahaschalas hadin tzarich liftach lo hisker beis hamedrash b'pnei shebeikar hadin ein tzarich. Notice that the way the Shulchan Aruch's language is, he doesn't say that you should have windows opposite where you're davening in the synagogue. The only time that he mentions the synagogue in the Shulchan Aruch is when he talks about the 12 windows. But as far as opening up windows to begin with, he says just in a bias, he doesn't say liftoach pesachim o chalonos, but he doesn't talk about where you're opening these windows. V'rak al pi minhag si'im v'tov shiva beis haknesses, and it's only based on the minhag that you should have them in a synagogue. So it could be that the Shulchan Aruch is slightly alluding to this Rambam, who only creates this halachic imperative only when you're davening privately. Al kol panim lefi sha'a osim chalonos bekosel hamizrach. But be that as it may, says Reb Chaim Ozer, whether the Shulchan Aruch was aware of this Tshuvas HaRambam and was alluding to it somewhat by saying that it's only a halachic imperative when you're davening privately and it's only a minhag when you're davening in a shul or not, he says, but the bottom line is, in our case, he says, you should open up the windows in the east. And we're not worried that maybe sometime in the future the windows will go dark because there'll be obstacles in front of them because of neighbors' properties, neighbor structures. He says, but he says, I'll go even further. He says, the reason why I'm not worried that the light will be blocked somewhat by people who will be building homes to the east of our shul, he says, because there's no measurement of light that the rabbis required. So even if I have diminished light coming into the windows, I'm still fulfilling the halachic requirement. He says, and according to the reason that is given for it, because you have to be able to focus towards Yerushalayim. He says, you have the windows there. Who cares if there's a lot of light streaming in through the window or not? As long as you can look out the window and think about what's beyond my window, which is Yerushalayim, what difference does it make how much light is coming in or how much light is not coming in? Ulatam hamuva b'toisus Rabbeinu Yona shayidei re'iyas ha'ortisya she'daito v'yochel lechavin karoi bevadai ein kepeda b'davar be'eza ruach gia chalonos. And remember, he also points out, according to Rabbeinu Yona, it doesn't matter where you position the windows in the shul. They can even be behind you, because the whole objective is to get light, natural daylight, to come into the room. But even according to Rabbeinu Yonah, that's not enough of a reason, he says, to switch the minhag from moving them from the east to the north. And certainly, to move the aron, for sure you don't have a heter. So you for sure got to move the aron, keep it in the east. You can't switch it, no matter what the architect says. And as far as the windows, put the windows in the east. And even if the light will be diminished, it's not a big deal, because the imperative is to keep the windows in the east whenever possible. So I just want to conclude where we are. So with this we'll conclude. From a halachic standpoint, if a person feels bad because he's davening in a room regularly where there are no windows, don't feel bad. Don't feel bad because you have the Tshuvas HaRambam to rely on, that the koach of the tzibur, the koach of the Beis HaKnesses. It seems more like it's the tzibur soul than the Beis HaKnesses, from the words of the Aruch HaShulchan. Don't worry, that's enough. That's going to be enough to supercharge your davening even without windows. But the consensus of the poskim is that when all things being equal, you should make sure that the Beis HaKnesses that you build has windows. And the reasons that we've seen at least 4 reasons for having windows. We've seen because you want light to stream in so that you have Yishuv Hadas. And I argue that artificial lighting does not provide the same Yishuv Hadas, certainly not aesthetically and certainly not psychologically, as natural daylight does streaming into a room. Another reason that we saw is because you want to be able to look out occasionally, like we saw during those times when you're not actively having kavana, and seeing the sky, and thinking about the Ribono Shel Olam and about your connection to Him. And for that reason, you don't require the windows, for those first 2 reasons, you don't require the windows to be directly in front of you. Even to the sides would be acceptable as long as you can occasionally glance through them. There's a good reason not to have the windows directly in front of you if they're going to be at eye level, because then you could get distracted by what's outside. And therefore, that's a good reason that even if you build the windows in the Mizrach, like the Rambam says, Keneged Yerushalayim, it's better to have them a little bit raised so that you don't, or at least opaque to some degree, or stained to some degree, so that you're not clearly seeing what's going on and you're not distracted. And also, like the Maharsha says, you want to be able to have a place for the prayer to escape, to go heavenward, and that's what the window represents as well. For all those reasons, and with this we'll conclude, I'm working with Rabbi Yisrael right now to draw up plans to install windows in the Turk Beis Medrash. Because if you look at the structure of the Turk Beis Medrash, two sides of the Turk Beis Medrash open up to the outside of the shul, where the two bookcases are in the north and the south part of that room. Perhaps there should have been windows installed to begin with. I don't know what the reasons were, but at least certainly now, if we put in those windows, we'll be able to fulfill the directive of Rashi and of Rabbeinu Yonah. We won't be able to put them in the Mizrach, though. That's the only thing that we won't be able to do, because behind the Aron in the Turk is a storage room. But we can certainly put them in place so that people can see the outside, people can see the sky. We'll have natural light streaming in, and it'll completely transform the quality of our tefillah, in my opinion. So, if you're interested in dedicating a window and having a permanent marker, making a permanent mark, please see Rabbi Yisrael.
What about stained glass, like you said, like we have in the Beit Knesset?
Right, so that's what I think Alan talked about this before you came in. It all depends on how you paskin. So the stained glass, it's questionable, because if the objective is to look out and see what's beyond it, like the Rambam seems to say, and perhaps like Rashi seems to intimate, you should be able to see the sky. So I wanted to argue that according to Rashi, maybe it's okay. The very fact that you see natural light streaming in from a stained glass window is still okay. In other words, that's still enough of a perception that I'm looking out to the sky. So I don't know. Stained glass is okay also. But
one of the answers on that was that even if you can just imagine what's beyond.
Yeah, you're imagining what's beyond. You're imagining what's beyond. But that's what the window is supposed to stimulate. It's supposed to stimulate the imagination in some way. Even if you can see the sky, it's only in the imagination of the Shekhinah.
I don't think it works. Ner Yisrael, Yeshiva, and their Beis Medrash, they only have stained windows. And I always feel, I'm just thinking about it now, like, I always feel like a little bit, because there's no windows, that psychologically it's still disturbing.
So
We have skylights upstairs.
yes, right.
So at least that takes care of that, hopefully, right?
Right,
You can
right.
see out.
Is there a relationship between the Zohar's 12 windows and the placement of those windows, or just there should be 12 windows somewhere?
We don't see that the Zohar, the Aruch HaShulchan, if anything, says that no, the requirement is only that there should be 12 windows. The placement is not the important issue. That was his whole point of bringing the Zohar.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I'm sure that this sugya is not to get somebody volunteering to buy a window.
No, that's not the reason why we learned this sugya. But if by some divine intervention someone were to come forth as a result of the Shiur and dedicate a window, right? If I were a wealthy man, and it wouldn't be such a bad thing.
But the truth of the whole discussion,
Yes.
according to my opinion, is it all depends on the people, what kavanah they have.
That's right. That's right.
If you have a good window and you see a tree and you think, ma'anoye, you have problem.
That's right. That's right. You're not supposed to be distracted by what's outside.
I
That's
could
right.
see it. For discussion, this was a beautiful thing. Kavanah is the main thing.
And that's right. And after all, we are in the Gruda Beis Medrash tonight. That's right.